Well, my friends, in a move that I certainly say that I did not expect here in 2026, OPEC is changing, and that is really something that is going to affect oil. Now, not expanding, as one may normally think, but rather shrinking, which is a really big deal. The United Arab Emirates would go and announce on April 28th, 2026, that it was withdrawing from both OPEC and the OPEC Plus Declaration of Cooperation, effective May 1st. And at the time that I'm making this here on May 8th in the evening of 2026, that information has not changed. And I really hope that it does not before this video goes out, or else I'm going to look incredibly stupid. But what is so fascinating here is that this decision is something that was conveyed through state news agency WAM and was confirmed by Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazrei in subsequent media appearances. It came out of the blue. It was just announced. There was no formal, notice, weeks advance, anything, just 3 days. That's it. The exit would end approximately 59 years of UAE membership, dating back to Abu Dhabi's ascension in 1967, and interestingly enough, it follows some other exits, with Qatar leaving in 2019 and Angola in January of 2024, which means that we've had 3 different members withdraw over the course of 7 years, and that is not something that had ever really happened in OPEC's entire history. This is actually something that is very fascinating because I do not believe that many people were paying attention, or at least not paying too close of attention when the previous 2 countries left. But now that a third has, and it is a Gulf state, the largest one among them to do so, the world has been rightfully wondering, what exactly is going on?
Side note, I know, but my wife and I genuinely do enjoy building beds together because we unfortunately have a tendency to break them. Don't look at me like that, it's not what you think. When my wife and I first got married, she asked me a question about wrestling moves and how, a German suplex works because she saw or heard of it and she didn't think that it was real or could function. And I told her, hey, I could do this. And she's like, no, you can't. And I said, yes, I can. Watch this. So I took her to the bedroom and then I German suplexed her onto our bed and proceeded to break it. And this is when we had, no money to do anything. So we lived on a broken bed for, years. This time though, we didn't actually break one of our beds, so we're building a new guest bed for our guest room here that is a Japanese joinery bed, which is thanks to Flexispot.
And thank you to Flexispot for sponsoring this video. And for those of you who are not familiar with what Flexispot is, they are an amazing ergonomic and space-saving furniture company that produces, they're famous for desks and also chairs, which is half the furniture in my house here at this point, but also now beds. As the name implies, with it being a joinery bed, there's no screws or anything you have to put into this. It's using Japanese joinery technique, which is literally carving the wood in such a way that the overlapping slots of it actually fit in and it connects and holds itself up. So there's no power drills or anything else that is necessary, no screwdriver even or anything simple like that. No, you just join it all together. And historically, the Japanese had to do this because, quite frankly, the quality of their iron sucked. And so every time there was a major fire, they would have peasants that would search through the fires to literally pull the nails out of beams because they had no other real sources of iron. There we go. Oh, wait, nope, not this one. There's this one. There we go. You literally just tie this in. It's no tools, no nothing. Just hand tighten and boom. That's just one. And then there's 3 others and that's it. But easiest part of this whole thing. Honestly, that's the final product. Genuinely, this is actually incredibly cool. And it's so easy because I don't have to actually do anything with any tools. Sustainably sourced, super durable, and simultaneously no squeaking. No squeaking. Yeah, I guess this is my new guest room bed, and honestly, the price is so good for the quality that you're actually getting for this thing. And if you want a discount, you can actually click the link down in my description and get an even better price. So I'm telling you right now, don't miss out on the quality that you're gonna get with this and a good night's sleep. Might even want to listen to my videos while you do so.
The announcement that we're talking about here would land one day before a scheduled OPEC Plus video conference, and during the 2026 Iran war that, at the time that, again, I am making this here in early May, it is still technically ongoing. The reason that I bring that up is because I am sure you who is watching this is aware that oil sourcing and prices have been a bit screwed as of late. OPEC's March production levels would collapse 27% to 20.79 million barrels per day, the largest single-month supply contraction in the organization's history. Brent crude would reach a wartime high near $126 per barrel during the conflict before retreating towards $111 by the time that the announcement date went out, and now we await to see what has come next. In fact, I'm actually struggling to think of, even at the time that I'm doing this, what the actual price of oil is, because I believe now from the time this video goes up, it has gone up. So everything is screwy, and we are just trying to wait again and see what is going to happen next. But the reason I say that, the reason that I am bringing up all of these points, my friends, is that a lot of you are probably wondering why this is happening. Why is this a big deal? What exactly is going to happen next, and how is this going to affect oil, which inevitably, and I know it sounds weird to focus on this, but it's accurate, affects everything. And that is just a part and parcel of living in the modern day and age. Well, my friends, here on the History of Everything, we are going to answer exactly those questions. But in order to do so, we have to go back and look at some context first so you can understand what exactly OPEC is, what the UAE's relationship with it has been. And so, in order to be able to explain that, we're going to need to dive into the past. Now, when I say that, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, as in my previous videos, we have talked about OPEC before, but I do not think that we have properly explained it in its entirety and why it exists. And that is something that is honestly just not right. We are supposed to cover everything, and that is exactly what we are going to do. Basically, to go back to the beginning, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly known as OPEC, is a cartel of oil producing nations founded back in 1960, and its primary purpose is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member countries to ensure the stabilization of oil markets in order to ensure an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to consumers, a steady income to producers, and a fair return on capital for those who are investing in the petroleum industry. Basically, OPEC exists to make sure that prices get neither too high or too low while still maintaining profits in order to be able to keep these countries going that have large oil industries. Before OPEC, the global oil industry was something that was dominated by the Seven Sisters, a group of Anglo-American multinational oil companies such as what would later become Shell, BP, Exxon, and Chevron, which I'm sure you're already familiar with those names. These companies essentially controlled oil production, pricing, and refining in the Middle East and just about everywhere, often keeping the price of crude oil low in order to maximize their own refining margins and profits. But as time went on, things were going to change. In the 1950s, the influx of Soviet oil and a glut of supply would cause oil prices to drop, and the host governments of the areas where it is that all this oil was coming from in the first place felt that the entire system was just not fair. They were not receiving a fair share of the profits for their own natural resources. And so, in response, representatives from Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, they would go meet in Baghdad in September of 1960 to form OPEC. Now, their initial goal was to gain greater control over their national resources and increase the price of oil to levels that they deemed fair, and this is the way that things worked from that point. Now, as for the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, at the time of OPEC's founding, the territory that would become the UAE did not yet exist as an independent nation. The seven sheikdoms of the lower Persian Gulf Coast, this being Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, Ras Al Khaimah, and Fujairah, were collectively known as the Trucial States, a British protectorate that was established through a series of treaties in the 19th century, beginning with the General Treaty of Peace back in 1820 and the Perpetual Maritime Truce of 1853. Basically, Britain would handle the foreign affairs of these small little sheikdoms and the defense of these territories, while their hereditary rulers would manage their own internal governance. But they were still under British rule overall. Oil had been discovered in commercial quantities in Abu Dhabi back in 1958 at the Shaif offshore field, with the first exports being in 1962. And that is something that would transform what had been a very impoverished pearl fishing and date farming economy into a rapidly emerging petroleum power. After this, Dubai would follow with its own oil discovery at the Fatah field in 1966, with exports then beginning in 1969. And so by the late 1960s, Abu Dhabi in particular was producing significant quantities of crude oil. But the thing is, as this was the Trucial States and not the United Arab Emirates, there was no real independent voice that they had in international petroleum politics because, again, they are not a sovereign state yet. In fact, this is actually something that I want to touch upon here real quick because in a development that is oftentimes misunderstood, the entity that actually joined OPEC in 1967 was not the United Arab Emirates, which again did not exist yet, but rather the Emirate of Abu Dhabi that was acting on its own. Abu Dhabi became a member of OPEC in November of 1967. It was the seventh nation to join the organization after the original five, plus Qatar, which had joined in 1961, and Indonesia and Libya, both of which had joined in 1962. Now, at the time, Abu Dhabi was the only crucial state that was producing oil in OPEC relevant quantities. And Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, who had become ruler of Abu Dhabi only in August of 1966 after going and deposing his older brother, Sheikh Shakbut, in a peaceful palace coup, would see membership as a means of asserting Abu Dhabi's political and economic standing on the international stage. Now, when I describe that, this is a very unusual circumstance because we have a sub-national entity that is technically speaking, still under British protection, but it is joining what was a organization of sovereign states. Still, OPEC would go and accept Abu Dhabi because of its growing oil production and the political importance of expanding Arab membership in the organization. Now, that situation is something that would change fundamentally on December 2nd, 1971, when six of the seven crucial states, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and Fujairah, would go and federate to form the United Arab Emirates, following Britain's announcement in 1968 that it was going to withdraw from east of Suez and end its protectorate obligations. Ras Al Khaimah would go and join the federation on February 10th, 1972, and that is what would end up completing the Seven Emirate Union, thus forming the UAE. Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi would become the first president of the UAE, and Sheikh Rashid bin Zayed Al Maktoum of Dubai would become the first vice president and prime minister, which is an arrangement reflecting Abu Dhabi's status as the wealthiest and largest emirate, as it, if you saw any of the previous videos that I did on this, contains around 87% of the Federation's entire territory and the overwhelming majority of its oil reserves. This is something that was balanced against Dubai's commercial importance, and that is something that would evolve over time. Following the formation of the UAE, Abu Dhabi's OPEC membership was effectively transferred to the new federation, and thus it is at this point that the UAE assumed Abu Dhabi's seat at OPEC, becoming the organization's representative for all seven emirates. Now, in practice, however, OPEC dealings with the UAE have always been dominated by Abu Dhabi, which, I mean, if you're looking at the total amount of oil that is controlled, Abu Dhabi controls now around 96% of the country's oil reserves, around 90 something to 100 billion barrels of proven reserves, which makes the UAE home to the world's seventh largest proven oil reserves. Dubai's reserves were always very modest and have largely since this point been depleted, which is one of the key reasons why, with time, Dubai would pivot decades ago to building its own economy around trade, finance, tourism, real estate, and logistics, whereas Abu Dhabi continued to rely heavily on hydrocarbons. So, just a little bit of information for anyone who's curious why, oh, if they have so much oil, what exactly is going on? And why is Dubai focused on all this diversification efforts? It's because Dubai never really had much oil in the first place. They had a little bit to get them started, but they really had to become a trade hub and an investor in so many other areas to actually develop themselves. Anyway, for the first decade that it existed, OPEC had very limited impacts, as the Seven Sisters still held significant sway in the overall oil market. But after the geopolitical landscape began to shift dramatically in the 1970s, so too did the market. The pivotal moment would first come with the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where, in support of Egypt and Syria, OPEC Arab members, led by Saudi Arabia, would impose an oil embargo on nations that were perceived as supporting Israel, especially the United States and the Netherlands. This would trigger the 1973 oil crisis, where the price of oil would quadruple from roughly $3 per barrel to 12. That is something that would demonstrate OPEC's immense power to influence the global economy and would shift the balance of power away from Western oil companies to these sovereign states where the oil was actually located, much to the annoyance of the Western states that began to suffer greatly because of it. Now, this era was something that was further cemented by the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which caused a massive drop in Iranian production. And although this was a supply shock rather than a deliberate OPEC cut, prices would still skyrocket again, peaking near $40 a barrel. So think on this in the first place. By the beginning of the decade, we're talking $3 a barrel, and this goes all the way up to 40. That is insane. For the UAE, which was then under the leadership of Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan as president of the Federation and ruler of Abu Dhabi, The second oil shock is something that generated an enormous windfall of revenues at exactly the moment when the country was investing heavily in its own nation building. ADNOC, ADNOC, which had been founded in 1971, that is something that was rapidly developing institutional capacity for the United Arab Emirates and its oil. And the UAE's production was around 1.8 million barrels per day in 1979, a very significant amount. The price surge meant that even with the more modest production volumes that they had at the time in comparison to now, the UAE was earning revenues that dwarfed anything that it had received during the entire decade prior to the 1973 embargo in just like 1 year. Because of this, Sheikh Zayed would go and channel these revenues into ambitious development programs. The Sheikh Zayed Road Network, federal universities, hospitals, housing projects, the foundations of what would become the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which was formally established in 1976 but began to receive a massive inflow of cash after this period would happen. Basically, anything and everything that they could throw money at, they started to do so. And the UAE also continued its pattern of generous foreign aid to other Arab states, Muslim majority countries, and developing nations using oil wealth as a tool of soft power that built diplomatic capital across multiple regions. This is where they really started to gain power, not just for themselves, but globally. Also, at the same time that I'm describing that, the Iranian Revolution would fundamentally alter how the UAE would handle its own security, and this is something that really needs to be touched upon. Because while it is that the previous years, as I described, allowed the UAE to build up its own soft power, it really did not have the population or military capability of actually standing up on its own. It needed other larger powers around it to actually handle regional security. So the Shah of Iran had been a key pillar of the Western aligned regional order, and his fall created a lot of uncertainty about what exactly the future of Iran was going to be and what it was going to do or what its intentions were with the Arab Gulf states. The new Islamic Republic's revolutionary rhetoric, which called for the export of the revolution and challenged the legitimacy of any monarchical Arab governments, was deeply alarming to Abu Dhabi and the other Gulf capitals. In addition to that, Iran's seizure of three islands, Abu Masa and the Greater and Lesser Tums, in 1971 from Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, just days before the UAE would go and federate, that had already, with the Shah, created a territorial dispute that the Shah had managed, but now the Islamic Republic was inheriting that issue, and that was not something that was ever going to get resolved. The revolutionary government's hostile posturing meant that the island dispute became a permanent feature of UAE Iranian relations and remains unresolved to this day. These tensions would push the UAE closer to Saudi Arabia and other conservative Gulf monarchies and the United States, creating the conditions for the formation of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, in May of 1981. And that is something that would bring together the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman in a security and economic alliance that was largely designed to counterbalance both the revolutionary forces of Iran and revolutionary movements in general, as these were very conservative Islamic governments that did not want potential upheaval to take place. Now, for anyone who is wondering why it is that I'm going on about all these different details of context, etc., about the United Arab Emirates and its relations with the states around it, you have to understand the way that the UAE was to know why it is behaving the way that it is today. Because this, the GCC, that is something that would bind the Gulf states together. Yes, it is something that would absolutely do that. But at the same time that that happened, the events of the 1980s and beyond were going to start showing just how fragile this relationship actually was, especially with Saudi Arabia. First event to do this was the Iran-Iraq War, which began in September of 1980 when Saddam Hussein's Iraq would go and invade Iran, and that would dramatically complicate OPEC dynamics over the course of the entirety of the 80s. As remember, both belligerents were major OPEC producers, and both decided to pump aggressive amounts of oil in order to fund their war efforts, oftentimes with little regard for OPEC's quota system or market discipline. As one would expect from a sudden increase of supply, this would collapse the price of oil initially, which had peaked at around $40 a barrel, or the equivalent of what is now like $140 to $160 per barrel today, depending on the year that you're looking at in the early 1980s. The UAE, under the continued leadership of Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan as president and Sheikh Rashid bin Zayed Al Maktoum of Dubai as vice president and prime minister, would find itself in a rather enviable position of they were now able to generate stupid amounts of revenue that were able to be channeled into ambitious infrastructure projects, development of federal government institutions, the establishment of sovereign wealth vehicles, most notably the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the ADIA, which, yes, had been founded back in 1976, as I said before, but because of this, was now able to rapidly accumulate assets over the course of the 80s. However, even with me saying that, the very success of OPEC's pricing power during the 1970s and the early 1980s, that is something that would sow the seeds of future crises, as the high prices would go and stimulate both demand destruction in consuming countries, which went and invested heavily in energy efficiency and alternative fuels so that they weren't dependent so much on oil, and supply expansion in non OPEC regions like the North Sea, Mexico, and Alaska meant that other sources of oil were able to be sought, and that is something that meant that OPEC didn't have as much power. By 1982, OPEC was forced, for the first time in its history, to introduce formal production quotas to defend their own prices, which had collapsed and continued to fall over the course of the 80s, with the organization setting a ceiling of 18 million barrels per day distributed among its members. As for the UAE's role in all this, they were assigned a quota of approximately 1.1 million barrels per day, which the country generally accepted, though Abu Dhabi's oil officials would privately express concerns that the quota system did not adequately reflect the Emirates' production capacity, which exceeded 1.5 million barrels per day. So even though they were capable of producing that, they had to reduce their overall output by a third, practically. Saudi Arabia would take on the role of being a swing producer, cutting its production dramatically to defend prices or increasing its production as needed in order to be able to not let prices get too high, while the UAE and other members were bound to their quotas, but they would frequently exceed their assigned quotas, though the overproduction was modest in comparison to that of more egregious cheaters like Nigeria, Venezuela, and Iran, which, as I said before, had a death war to fund. Now, regardless, this is something that would contribute to the downward pressure on prices over the course of the early to mid 1980s, and it is because of this the crisis came to a dramatic head in 1986. This being when Saudi Arabia, frustrated by the persistent quota cheating of fellow OPEC members and the continued erosion of its own market share, which had fallen from over 10 million barrels per day in 1980 to less than 3 million barrels per day by 1985, and that is a huge amount, would abandon its swing producer role and dramatically increase its production through a strategy known as net back pricing. The result was catastrophic for oil markets, with the price collapsing from around $27 per barrel in late 1985 to below $10 per barrel by mid 1986. Mind you, this is down from what had been less than a decade ago of 40. The UAE was significantly affected by this collapse, as oil revenues would plummet and the country was forced to delay or cancel various development projects. Within OPEC, the UAE would generally support Saudi Arabia's eventual return to a quota based system later in 1986, finally recognizing that price collapse is something that hurts all producers, though tensions over quota allocation and compliance is something that would persist throughout the remainder of the decade and way beyond. And keep in mind when I say that, that is something that is relevant to the very issue that we were talking about now in 2026. Either way, though, one of the key reasons for all of this was that the Iran Iraq War, which had raged throughout the entire decade until its conclusion in August of 1988, is something that complicated things. The UAE, like other Gulf Cooperation Council states, was generally aligned with Iraq during the conflict and would provide substantial financial support to Saddam Hussein's regime, while simultaneously maintaining commercial and pragmatic relations with Iran, especially through Dubai, which became a very important trading hub for goods reaching the Iranian market despite international sanctions. This delicate balancing act would extend into OPEC meetings, where the UAE would oftentimes play a mediating role between Iranian and Iraqi delegations, who would frequently clash over quota allocations, with both countries demanding higher production allowances in order to be able to further fund their war efforts. And then they would just do this anyway. So that is where things get really bad. As the 1980s draw to a close, tensions over OPEC quota compliance would reach a very dangerous breaking point because in 1990, oil prices had fallen back to around $15 to $18 per barrel. And Iraq, which was emerging from its devastating war with Iran, had massive debts and a very damaged economy with basically nothing gained from the conflict whatsoever. And they, as a result of this, became an increasingly vocal critic of Kuwait, the UAE, and others. They blamed them for the depressed oil prices, accusing both countries of systematically exceeding their OPEC quotas and engaging in what Saddam Hussein called economic warfare against Iraq. In a now infamous speech in July of 1990, Saddam specifically would accuse Kuwait and the UAE of costing Iraq billions of dollars through their overproduction, which is likely true, yes, but it really is at this point like the pot calling the kettle black. Like, yes, the UAE had indeed been producing above its quota of around 1.1 million barrels per day. Yes, they were. They absolutely were. And they hastily would agree at an OPEC meeting in late July of 1990 to cut production back to their actual assigned quota. But by this point, that concession came way too late in order to alter Saddam's calculations. And so it was on August 2nd, 1990, that Iraqi forces would invade Kuwait. And so we have the Gulf War. Crazy how that happens, I know. The Gulf War, in turn, had major implications for the UAE's role in OPEC, as the country provided crucial logistical and financial support to the US led coalition that would eventually liberate Kuwait in early 1991. And during the period of war, when Iraq and Kuwaiti production was effectively removed from the world markets, because remember, all the oil fields are being destroyed, the UAE, along with Saudi Arabia, would dramatically increase their own production to fill the supply gap, with the UAE output rising to over 2 million barrels per day by late 1990. That is up from their quota of what it had been of 1.1 million, practically doubling what they were making. This experience would essentially cement the UAE's reputation as a fairly reliable supplier and a moderate force within OPEC, something that was willing to use its production capacity to stabilize markets, which, yes, of course, they were benefiting from this heavily in the first place by increasing production when prices were high, sure, but also at the same time that they did this, the UAE would support the continued exclusion of Iraqi oil from formal OPEC quota arrangements while Iraq remained under United Nations sanctions, a position that aligned with Saudi and Kuwaiti preferences, and Iraq absolutely hated. So Iraq basically couldn't do anything during this time. And that, as you can expect, would lead to a number of hard feelings. But it's okay because from this point, though, throughout the 1990s, the UAE would largely adopt a relatively low profile. They didn't do anything crazy like it is that they had been doing, focusing more on quietly expanding their production capacity, while at the same time generally adhering to assigned quotas. So even if they could technically pump a lot more, they weren't really doing this. They were just increasing their ability to do it in the first place. So, under the continued leadership of Sheikh Zayed and with the increasingly prominent role of his sons, especially Crown Prince Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the UAE would pursue a strategy of maximizing their long term value of their hydrocarbon resources rather than seeking short term price spikes that might accelerate the development of alternative energy sources or help non OPEC supply. ADNOC would continue to develop new fields and enhance recovery from the existing ones, gradually building production capacity that by the end of the decade had reached 2.5 million barrels per day. And that is something that would only go up. This is something that was great for them because oil prices remained relatively stable at $15 to $20 per barrel over the course of the mid 90s, but there was a dramatic price collapse in 1998 when the prices would fall below $10 per barrel due to a combination of the Asian financial crisis, which reduced demand in Asia, one of the largest consumers of oil that was up and coming, and also there was an ill-timed decision that OPEC made to increase production in late 1997, right as the crash was taking place. Despite the setback, the UAE was an active participant in the emergency production cuts that OPEC would implement in 1998 and 1999, working closely with Saudi Arabia, Mexico, which was a non OPEC producer at the time, and Venezuela in what became known as the Riyadh Pact. That is something that would help to successfully restore prices to the more reasonable $25 to $30 range by the year 2000. And that episode is something that would foreshadow the later OPEC Plus cooperation framework, but we're not quite there yet. Instead, what it is that we need to do now here, my friends, is we have to talk about the time that changed everything as we know it, not just for the Middle East, but also for the world in general. The first decade of the 21st century is something that would bring what many analysts called commodity super cycling. Prices began climbing in 1999 to 2000, and this is something that paused during the post 9/11 recession, then began another climb that would take Brent crude from around $25 per barrel in 2003 to $147 per barrel by July of 2008. As for why that was happening in the first place, the drivers of it were multiple. You had surging Chinese demand as the country's industrial economy was expanding rapidly. You had more constrained non OPEC supply growth, despite high prices. You had geopolitical risks with the Iraq war because the US was doing its thing in the Middle East, and increasing speculation in oil's futures markets as financial investors were flooding into commodities. Oh, hi. Hi. Do you like oil, my dear? You are the most American cat I've ever heard. Yes, hello. This is Moonbeam, everyone. She enjoys tales of horror, and also her tail in my face. Anyway, regardless of why it happened, for the UAE, these years would bring about unprecedented wealth. Government revenues would soar, sovereign wealth funds would grow dramatically, and Dubai's debt fueled construction boom would create the iconic skyline that would define the city's global image. Like the whole reason why Dubai looks the way that it does and transformed from a little desert backhole into what it is today is this time period. The UAE's production during this period would grow gradually from around 2.2 million barrels per day in the early 2000s to 2.7 million by 2008. But the price increases meant revenues would grow far faster than actual production volumes. They really couldn't keep up with it. It sounds weird, but generally speaking, within OPEC, the 2000s was a period of relative cohesion where everyone got along because the very high prices of the day reduced the temptation to cheat on their own quotas. The cartel's main challenges were actually managing prices on the upside, as in preventing them from going way too high that they triggered demand destruction or accelerated the development of alternatives, rather than defending prices from going lower. So, as a result, OPEC made several production increases during the 2000s, attempting to moderate price. Though this is often something that was criticized by consuming countries like the United States for not increasing enough. The UAE would generally align with Saudi Arabia's market management approach during this period, and they would support moderate production increases when prices would spike and accepting the cartel's broader strategy. It was, overall, pretty good for them. But remember, what goes up must come down, and this is something that complicates things. The 2008 financial crisis and the resulting price collapse, this being from around $147 per barrel in July of 2008 to around $32 per barrel by December of 2008, that was a sharp shock that prompted dramatic OPEC action. In late 2008, OPEC would announce production cuts of 4.2 million barrels per day, the largest in its entire history up to this point, and the UAE would participate fully in implementing these cuts. That crisis is something that would hit Dubai especially hard as its real estate bubble burst and the Emirates' debts, which was estimated at around $80 to $100 billion, threatened a major default. In late 2009 and 2010, Abu Dhabi would provide emergency financial support to Dubai, including a $10 billion bond purchase that allowed Dubai to meet its immediate obligations. This bailout would fundamentally rebalance power within the UAE Federation, making Dubai more dependent on Abu Dhabi's oil derived wealth and reducing Dubai's previous semi autonomous economic posture. In fact, the big tower that we all know of, the Burj Khalifa, that wasn't supposed to be called the Burj Khalifa. That was the Burj Dubai. It was renamed the Burj Khalifa in honor of the Abu Dhabi ruler whose financial support had saved the entire project and the emirate in general. From this point, my friends, the early 2010s would see oil prices recover to around $100 per barrel, and the OPEC framework and relationship of its members did remain fairly solid. But it is at this point, why are you digging your claws into me there, Moonbeam? I'm sorry, I know you don't like me talking about towers, but ow. So it is, my friends, that things would recover a bit after this. The early 2010s would see oil prices recover to around $100 per barrel, and the OPEC framework and relationship of its members remained fairly solid. But at the same time that everything that I'm talking about was going on, everything was about to rapidly change again. And the reason for that is because of something that is arguably the most fundamental challenge to OPEC's market power since its entire founding: the American shale oil revolution. Basically, to explain this, beginning around 2010 and then accelerating dramatically in subsequent years, US oil production would grow from less than 500,000 barrels per day to over 9 million barrels per day by 2019. This is something that would fundamentally alter the global oil supply picture and create a new swing producer, something that could operate outside of OPEC's control. For the UAE and other OPEC members, this development would present an existential strategic question because they didn't know what to do with it. Should the organization go and defend prices through production cuts? Which, if they did that, yes, it could help oil prices, but it would cede market share to American producers. Or should they defend their own market share through maintaining or even increasing production, which could suppress prices and potentially bankrupt the higher cost producers of the United States? Because shale operators, especially in the beginning, they did not have good profits. So if they could punish them by dropping things to a price that was below operating costs, there was no way they would be able to function. This is the question that would be passed back and forth for years and would eventually come to a head in November of 2014, when Saudi Arabia, with the support of the UAE and Kuwait, would push through a controversial OPEC decision to maintain production levels despite collapsing prices, in an attempt to defend market share and force higher cost producers, like the American shale I talked about, out of the market. UAE Energy Minister Suhail Al Mosrey, who had taken office back in 2013, would publicly support this strategy, arguing that price defense through production cuts was futile when so much new supply was emerging from outside of OPEC. Oil prices would thus collapse from over $100 per barrel in mid 2014 to under $30 per barrel by early 2016, which would cause severe fiscal stress across all OPEC members, including the UAE, which was forced to implement austerity measures, including a value added tax that they had to implement in 2018, and would accelerate economic diversification efforts because they realized there is no way in hell we are going to be able to be entirely dependent on just oil. Really, by late 2016, it had become clear that the strategy of defending market share had not worked as intended. American shale producers had proven way more resilient than expected, having dramatically reduced their break even costs through technological innovation, while OPEC members and other producers like Russia were suffering severe economic damage. This realization led to one of the most significant developments in OPEC's history, the formation of OPEC Plus through the Declaration of Cooperation signed in Vienna on December 10th, 2016, which would bring together the 13 OPEC members with 11 non OPEC producers, most importantly, Russia. All of this in a coordinated effort to manage global oil supply and keep prices higher. The UAE was an enthusiastic supporter of this new framework, with Minister Al Mosrey playing an active role in the negotiations that led to its creation. Under the initial OPEC Plus agreement, the UAE would commit to cut production by 139,000 barrels per day from their October 2016 reference level of 3 million barrels, bringing their production to around 2.874 million barrels per day. Everyone else would follow a similar pattern. And so, throughout the late 2010s, the UAE would generally maintain good compliance with OPEC Plus's agreements, while continuing its strategy of expanding underlying production capacity. However, as time went on, structural tension between the UAE and OPEC, this is something that was building. Abu Dhabi had announced ambitious plans to increase production capacity to 4 million barrels per day by 2020 and then 5 million barrels by 2030. Mind you, they were only producing around half of that at this time. And this is something that would require billions of dollars in investment in upstream development. Yet, despite these efforts, OPEC quotas were calculated based on baselines that didn't actually reflect this expanded capacity, meaning the UAE was being asked to keep an increasing share of their own capacity offline relative to their peers. And they didn't like that. But hey, even with these tensions, it really shouldn't be a problem as long as demand remains relatively stable and nothing shuts down the global economy, right? Oh yeah, it's COVID time. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 would create the most severe demand shock in oil market history, with global consumption falling by around 20 to 25 million barrels per day at the peak of lockdowns in April of 2020. Compounding this crisis was a brief but consequential dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia in March of 2020, which led to the temporary collapse of the OPEC Plus agreement and a price war that would see Saudi Arabia and the UAE briefly increase production to record levels, with the UAE producing around 4 million barrels per day in April of 2020, way above their previous quotas. This combined demand collapse and supply surge would cause oil prices to crash to historic lows, including the famous incident on April 20th, 2020, when WTI futures would briefly trade at negative prices due to storage constraints. That is right. They basically had to give away oil or just they were losing money on anything that they produced. And that was a really bad thing. This crisis was eventually resolved through the largest production cut agreement in OPEC Plus history, signed on April 12th, 2020, which would eventually remove around 9.7 million barrels per day from the world's market in its initial phase. The UAE would agree to a substantial production cut, with its baseline being established at around 3.168 million barrels per day, and its actual production target falling to around 2.446 million barrels per day during the deepest phase of cuts. Now, that baseline figure of 3.168 million, that would become a source of significant frustration for the UAE in subsequent years, as the country would argue that it did not reflect the substantial investment that they had made trying to expand their way all the way to 5 million since 2018. That is where most people begin to start explaining what has happened now, because this is the part where everything that I have been building up this entire time, this is where it all comes to a head. July of 2021, as OPEC Plus was negotiating extended production cuts that had been implemented after the price collapse of 2020. The UAE, through its energy minister, would publicly object to the terms, demanding a higher baseline that reflected their current capacity of around 3.8 million barrels per day rather than the 3.17 million baseline that was being used. Saudi Arabia and the UAE would engage in unprecedented public spats, with senior officials going and giving competing television interviews, making their own case, arguing with each other publicly. This dispute would briefly freeze OPEC Plus's decision making and would raise genuine speculation that the UAE at this time might just outright leave the cartel. But after several weeks of tension, a compromise was reached in which the UAE would receive a higher baseline of around 3.5 million barrels per day, along with similar adjustments for Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, and Kuwait. Everything was peaceful in the end, but we had to talk about this because the 2021 episode was way more significant beyond the just immediate resolution. This is because it demonstrates that the UAE was no longer going to be just a junior partner. They were willing to publicly challenge Saudi Arabia and risk the entire cohesion of OPEC Plus to defend their own interests. It also would showcase broader divergences in the relationship between UAE and Saudi Arabia that had been taking place across multiple different areas. The two countries had been close partners throughout the 2010s, jointly intervening in Yemen against the Houthis from 2015 onwards, jointly imposing the blockade on Qatar from 2017 to 2021, and also supporting various aligned governments and forces across the region. They worked together, they were partners, but by the 2019 to 2020 period, the UAE had begun winding down their military commitment in Yemen. They were frustrated by the conflict's lack of resolution, and they were shifting more towards supporting the southern Yemeni separatist forces, whose interests didn't fully align with Saudi backed Yemeni government forces. The UAE was also way more reluctant than Saudi Arabia to fully reconcile with Qatar after the Alula agreement that ended the blockade in January of 2021. Along with this, the UAE's August 2020 normalization with Israel through the Abraham Accords, that had been pursued without close coordination with Saudi Arabia, which was far more cautious about formal Israeli ties, as Saudi Arabia still saw itself as the leader of the Arab Muslim world. And that's just the geopolitics. The economic aspects of the UAE Saudi competition would intensify over the course of the 2020s, with Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman launching Vision 2030 that began to aggressively pursue the exact same type of economic diversification, foreign investment, and tourism development that the UAE, especially Dubai, had been pioneering. In 2021, Saudi Arabia would announce that foreign companies that were seeking government contracts had to relocate their regional headquarters to Riyadh by 2024, which, of course, is a direct challenge to Dubai's status as the regional business hub, because any businesses that wanted to do major contracts in Saudi Arabia would have to move from Dubai to Riyadh. The two countries were increasingly competing for the exact same type of foreign investment, the same sporting events, the same conferences, the same talent. This competition would spill over into energy policy, with both countries trying to maximize their own hydrocarbon revenues during what they viewed as a transition period before potential peak oil demand, which at the time that I'm making this is right now predicted to take place anywhere between 2030 and 2040. From that point, oil demand is only set to decrease. Still, at the same time this was all happening, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 would create another major test of OPEC plus unity and the UAE's own positioning, as Western governments would impose sanctions on Russia and would pressure Gulf producers to increase output to offset Russian disruption. The UAE found itself in a very delicate position here. And initially, in early March of 2022, UAE ambassador to the US, Yusuf Al Otaiba, would actually make comments suggesting that the UAE did support increasing OPEC plus production, which briefly did drive down prices by a couple dollars. But then within hours, the energy minister, Mazare, would go and publicly reaffirm the UAE's commitment to the existing OPEC plus framework, and then prices would go and recover because they wanted to keep things high. That episode would really reflect the genuine tensions in UAE policy. They wanted to maintain good relations with Western partners, like the US being the closest security partner of the country, while also maintaining OPEC plus discipline and the more lucrative relationship they had with Russia. Throughout 2022, the UAE would actually hold firm on OPEC Plus's commitments despite Western pressure, including even supporting the controversial October 2022 OPEC decision to cut production by 2 million barrels per day, which would draw very sharp criticism from the Biden administration and accuse Saudi Arabia and other producers of effectively supporting Russia's war effort by trying to keep prices high. Fast forward then, and in 2023, OPEC Plus would continue managing markets through a series of voluntary production cuts beyond the formal quota framework. Saudi Arabia would announce an additional voluntary cut of a million barrels per day in June of 2023, which extended multiple times into 2024. Other members, including the UAE, would make similar voluntary contributions. Through these mechanisms, OPEC Plus would maintain prices generally in the $75 to $90 range, despite weaker than expected Chinese demand growth and continued US production growth. The UAE would also, during this period, continue pushing for higher baselines for itself. And at the June 2023 OPEC Plus meeting, it managed to secure a baseline increase to 3.22 million barrels per day for 2024 after it had been dropped previously, with phased increases being planned after this. The June 2024 OPEC meeting would grant a further 300,000 barrel per day uplift to around 3.5 million barrels per day, while ADNOC would disclose crude production capacity of 4.85 million barrels per day. The 5 million barrel target that was set for 2030 was now being accelerated from that point to being able to be achieved by 2027. As a result, the structural gap between the authorized output and the physical capacity that the UAE could actually do, that would widen to 1.4 million barrels per day. But they were still being restricted. They weren't allowed to produce more. And that is something that would continue to be a source of frustration. And really, all the UAE needed at this point was some kind of major catalyst to make their exit from the whole relationship worthwhile. And that catalyst, my friends, that would come in 2026. In January of 2026, prior to the outbreak of the US Israel war with Iran, Trump had specifically pressured Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations to bring down the cost of oil while doubling down on threats to use tariffs as leverage. You can call this foreshadowing for what was to come, and you would probably be right, because the conflict that would break out in March would create an unprecedented energy crisis that exposed deep discord among Gulf nations about how to actually respond, with the closure or partial blockage of the Strait of Hormuz creating massive disruptions to oil flows from the region. For the UAE, the war made it a frontline state in ways that it had never really expected, with close to 2 million barrels per day of offshore production being shut in due to the regional crisis. The UAE would absorb this punishment largely alone, and tellingly, Emirati presidential advisor Anwar Gargash would make a pointed public statement at the Gulf Influencers Forum in mid-April of 2026, noting that the political and military response from Gulf Cooperation Council partners had been, quote, the weakest historically, end quote. This frustration, expressed publicly, would turn out to be very ominous, and it was a very clear sign of the rupture that was about to come. The International Energy Agency would report that as Gulf supplies became stuck, OPEC Plus's share of global oil output fell to around 44% in March of 2026 from 48% in February, with further declines being anticipated as production shut-ins became way more pronounced. Things were not looking good. And so, this was it. The stage had been set, and a fateful decision was now finally able to be made. On Tuesday, April 28th, 2026, the United Arab Emirates would publicly announce that it was quitting OPEC, removing its quota limit entirely, with the withdrawal to become effective as of May 1st. This would give just a 3 days notice and end a membership that had begun back in 1967, first through Abu Dhabi and then through the federal UAE after its formation in 71. The announcement was huge, not only for what it actually was doing in the first place, but the way that it was done. As Saudi Arabia, OPEC's unquestioned leader, would learn of the exit from a press release rather than through any prior consultation or heads up. The withdrawal would officially take effect on Friday, May 1st, marking the formal end of nearly 6 decades of UAE participation in OPEC. And with that exit, OPEC was now reduced to just 12 members: Algeria, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. This being alongside the much diminished broader OPEC Plus framework that since 2016 had also included Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Bahrain, Brunei, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, South Sudan, and Sudan. Experts immediately observed that the US government would welcome this move for its potential to curb the cartel's pricing power, with the UAE's stated desire to supply more oil than its OPEC quota, potentially helping to push prices down again once the Strait of Hormuz situation was actually resolved. And that, my friends, that is something that we really need to focus on, because many people may be wondering why. Why would the UAE choose now of all times to do this? After all, the Strait of Hormuz crisis means that it doesn't really matter how much oil you produce if you can't actually get it to the market in the first place. Thing is, that's actually kind of the point. The immediate market impact of the exit is likely to be very limited because the country's near term production was already being constrained by the Strait of Hormuz closure, with, again, around 2 million barrels per day of offshore production just being shut off, regardless of whatever policy changes they make. Like, they literally can't produce or do anything with it. This meant that the UAE could make its dramatic announcement without actually facing any immediate consequences of trying to flood the market into a chaotic supply situation. At the same time, though, the country was positioning itself for the post crisis world. They were betting that once shipping through the Gulf normalized, they would be able to ramp up exports aggressively from a position of complete freedom rather than being bound by quota negotiations. This in turn was possible because the alignment with Washington had been years in the making through the Abraham Accords, deepening security partnerships with Israel, and the positioning of Abu Dhabi as an indispensable Gulf ally. Because of all of these things, the OPEC exit was actually fairly natural and easy. There were no real consequences necessarily. As for what the effect of all this is going to be, though, we don't actually really know yet, as it's likely going to take until 2027 for any real changes to hit the market. Alongside that, as for the OPEC reaction in the immediate aftermath, this is something that would be both shock and also damage control. Some OPEC defenders would push back against the UAE's framing of everything being unfair, with one notable example being the Saudi commentator Al Saban, who dismissed the UAE's stated rationale as nonsense, because in his view, OPEC simply just adjusts production to maintain equilibrium and doesn't really do anything else. But other analysts would emphasize that with the loss of the UAE, a long standing OPEC member, that is something that could create genuine disarray and weaken the oil cartel, which had historically sought to show a more united front despite internal disagreements over a range of issues, from geopolitics to production quotas, etc. This was actually a really big problem. Perhaps most worrying for OPEC, the Council on Foreign Relations analysis would suggest that if the UAE could prove that leaving OPEC was not actually harmful for them, and in fact beneficial, other countries might consider following suit, which would potentially trigger a cascade effect. Wood Mackenzie would even speculate that the US administration could at some point pressure Venezuela, a founding member as well, to withdraw from OPEC, which would compound the damage to the organization's credibility and influence. Really, my friends, as I'm going and talking about this, what distinguishes the UAE's departure from other previous exits? Because remember, other things have taken place before, as I have mentioned. This has a convergence of three different forces that Foreign Policy magazine would identify in its own analysis. You had the Iran War, a deepening rivalry with Saudi Arabia, and a strategic realignment with Washington that had been years in the making. This was not like the Angola 2024 departure, which primarily was about a smaller producer chafing under quotas that it thought was unfair. The UAE was OPEC's second largest producer by liquid capacity, and its withdrawal would reshape oil markets through capacity growth, quota tension, and the Saudi rivalry that increased both supply and price risks substantially. The shift in OPEC's overall importance was already evident in the underlying numbers. The cartel had declined from controlling half of global supply at its peak to around a third today, with the addition of OPEC Plus collectively allowing them to produce around 41% of global supply before the UAE's exit would further weaken the framework. Their loss is actually going to be a very big deal. When the UAE exited OPEC on May 1st, in the words of one analysis, it was not the abandoning of a club so much as declaring that the club no longer served its interests. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding both why the withdrawal happened as well as what the future is actually going to bring. Because right now, my friends, the UAE's plan to add 1.5 million barrels per day of production by 2027 would, over time, help alleviate upward pressure on global oil prices. This is complemented by Abu Dhabi's strategic infrastructure projects, including new pipelines designed to transport oil directly from inland fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, which would effectively bypass the Strait of Hormuz and mitigate future supply disruptions should anything else happen with Iran, as this is a still strategic choke point. But that kind of move by the UAE would also likely provoke a sharp response from Saudi Arabia, which could instigate another price war. Riyadh's objective would be to punish the UAE for its departure and undermine the profitability of its own expanded production. The resulting sharp decline in oil prices would be strategically advantageous for the US and its allies for multiple reasons. This would intensify economic pressure on Iran. It would potentially force Tehran to the negotiating table as their price for oil would drop even lower, and this may allow them to actually get something out of their nuclear program. Similarly, it would further strain Russia's economy, which is already struggling to sustain its own protracted war in Ukraine. Domestically, falling oil prices would translate to lower gasoline costs for American consumers, which is a significant political benefit that could influence electoral outcomes. As energy prices are a critical factor in both the health of the US economy and also the political fortunes of the incumbent party. Right now, the fact that the war in Iran even took place during an election year is something that is deeply confusing for many analysts. But again, only time will tell. And so that is something where we're going to have to leave things here today. We will have to tell the story of how all of this goes down in the future, I'm sure, but until that point, we're going to have to be patient. My friends, thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate you. I hope to see you all here next time. If there's anything else that you'd like to see, let me know in the comment section down below. I think beyond this, I have a series of things that are going to be coming out. I'm going to be doing a series of thing on vodka and like alcohol problems in Russia. I'm also planning on doing a population crisis issue in Russia for one of these, which is going to start a whole series I'm planning on doing on demographics. And then beyond that, I think the next one I'm going to physically write now is going to be Spirit Airlines, because that honestly that's a story that needs to be addressed because it spells some very interesting futures that are to come for the airline industry. With that though, we're going to end things. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye everyone.